Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to this continued lecture on an overview of English poetry. In the last class, we discussed the origins of English poetry, and we discussed the early English poets, and through them we came to discuss Chaucer, and we described Chaucer as the first major English poet, or the father of English poet, and all that. So, now in the second class, what we are going to deal with is discuss English poetry from post Chaucer's period to through metaphysical poetry. Before we go to Elizabethan poetry, the first halt for us after Chaucer is John Skelton. Historically, John Skelton plays a major role, especially for those of us who are interested in political satire, how literature can be used as a kind of a political satire to ridicule the political structure and thereby critique it. Of course, the intention is not just to ridicule, but to bring in positive changes in political power structures, and therefore, considering Skelton's contribution to this particular genre of writing, Erasmus calls him the incomparable light and glory of English letters, the incomparable glory, light and glory of English letters, because he mastered a particular genre of English verse, which is political satires. So, in his works, he makes use of some kind of contemporary allegories, political satires, and ridicules established structures, especially in his book called A Ballad of the Scottish King. You can look at a kind of strange spellings. These are not misrepresentation of spellings. That's how they were originally spelt. We must keep those things in mind. That's how they were spelt. English language has changed considerably since then, but this is how these words were spelt at that point of time. In fact, Skelton's contribution is also there in his use of a certain meters. In fact, now that's come to be called Skeltonic meter. So, what does he do? Skeltonic meters are employed in verses which are short verses that have a kind of an irregular meter used by the Tudor poet John Skelton. That's why they are called Skeltonic meters. So, that's also his contribution to British English literature, English poetry as such. Whenever any work is used as a kind of a political satire, that belongs to a protest genre of literature, because the intention is more than lampooning and ridiculing. Here literature is used as a means of protest, a site of producing resistance and thereby marking your dissent. So, therefore, Skelton becomes important for us because he elevates literature and poetry, especially English poetry, as a literary site for protest, as a note of dissent. From Skelton, let us move on to Elizabethan poetry. In fact, for any serious student of poetry, especially serious student of English poetry, Elizabethan poetry marks a kind of a golden origin of great poetry. We come face to face with such body of poetry which excels on many fronts. Okay. So, Elizabethan poetry is really very important for us. One of the remarkable features of Elizabethan poetry is the introduction of the form of sub-form of poetry called sonnets. Of course, though sonnet was quite popular in other parts of Europe, especially in Italy. So, it was for the first time introduced into English poetry here during the Elizabethan period. Therefore, Elizabethan poetry marks the arrival of sonnet here. I do not need to introduce sonnets to you, because in one of our earlier classes we discussed sonnets in great detail, and even in a quiz followed by that class we discussed, there was a question, you can recall, right, how do you distinguish a Petrarchan sonnet from a Shakespearean sonnet and all that. So, generally a sonnet has 14 lines to that. Of course, we have also discussed exception to this 14 lines rule. There are sonnets, 12-line sonnets, they are called curtal sonnets, and 16-line sonnets, coda sonnets, and all that we have discussed. Here we need to remember that sonnets were introduced at this particular juncture of time. The credit of introducing sonnets into the English soil goes to Sir Thomas Watt. So, you can call rightfully, of course, him as the kind of father of English sonnets, Sir Thomas Watt, because again of his exposure to other European literature, especially Italian literature. He also has translated a couple of Petrarchan sonnets, but he has not just confined his literary service there. He went on to contribute sonnets, original sonnets to English poetry. His collection of 96 love poems is called Total's Miscellany. That is his contribution to English poetry. Almost it was posthumously published in 1557 after the poet's death. That is what you call posthumous publication, is publication of something after the death of the writer. And in this collection, about one-third of them, are, you can call them sonnets, and some of them are even translations from Petrarch. Here, until that point of time, sonnets were they were slightly impersonal. So, he has to his credit adding a kind of a personal touch, a personal note to English poetry through sonnets. That is something that has to be kept in mind. Along with Thomas Watt, Sir Thomas Watt, Henry Howard has also played a major role in introducing and popularizing the genre of sonnet, or the subtype of genre. Therefore, they share a joint credit for introducing sonnets here. And what is remarkable here is, we distinguished, right, Shakespearean sonnet from Petrarchan sonnet. So, these two guys were the precursors of what can be called Shakespearean sonnet. In fact, they were the ones who introduced the variation. The Petrarchan sonnet, if you recall, is it consists of two stanzas. One is an octave, an 8-line stanza, and another one a sestet, a 6 lines one. Whereas here it is 3 quatrains, 3 stanzas of 4-line stanzas, or a 4-line stanza, 3 of them, 4 3s are 12, plus a couplet. You have a couplet. So, these two are the precursors of English sonnets, or they can also be called later. They were perfected by an extraordinary literary figure the world has ever seen, called Shakespeare, but more of Shakespeare in subsequent slides. Before another stop before Shakespeare is Sir Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney occupied a major role, especially for his critical work called Apology for Poetry. In fact, there has been a kind of a debate between philosophy and poetry. Philosophers have pitted philosophy vis-a-vis poetry and have been declaring philosophy as a kind of a better than poetry or something like that. But in Apology for Poetry, Sidney almost champions the cause of poetry against philosophy. He scores a goal against philosophy and champions the cause of poetry. So that's his contribution when it comes to he's a literary critic, as that's his contribution. But as a poet, he has a remarkable collection of sonnets, love sonnets, Astrophel and Stella. That's something that has to be kept in mind. From Philip Sidney, again let's go to Edmund Spenser. Spenser too wrote sonnets, but of course not predominantly. Sonnets were not so much his preferred mode or medium of expression. He wrote poetry in other ways, especially pastoral poems. Somewhere in 1550s, is 1552-53 he was born. His remarkable contribution is the Fairy Queen. It's a kind of a long allegorical poem, a pastoral poem that you find in which he introduces his own particular type of stanza, which later comes to be called Shakespearean stanza. I am sorry, a Spenserian stanza, right? So a Spenserian stanza, I mean, if you are really curious to know, has 8 iambic pentameters, 8 iambic pentameter lines, followed by a 9th line of 6 iambic feet. So that's a kind of a variation that he brings in. So he writes about close to 90 Petrarchan sonnets and all that. From Spenser, let's go to Shakespeare. Probably if we can, Shakespeare comes to occupy the pinnacle of English literature. Why English literature alone? Any literature in the world. In fact, the name of Shakespeare is almost synonymous with extraordinary standards, literary standards anywhere across the globe. So he is like, you can replace literature with Shakespeare, something like that. So it's not an exaggeration if we say that there is nobody who is not aware of Shakespeare. In the world of letters, almost Shakespeare is the king, something like that. Maybe a hyperbole, but of course if we have read his works, it doesn't appear to be. He is a master of drama, master of poetry, master of sonnets, an exemplary literary figure. And his contribution to furthering English language is immense. Probably after the Bible, Shakespeare must have contributed many words to English language as such. Probably when it comes to individual, the highest contribution must have come from this great guy, William Shakespeare. That's why we say he needs no introduction to any serious student of literature. Of course, Shakespeare is well known for his plays. He has about 40 plus plays, about, let's say, some of them are, not all of them are available, but depending on whatever is available, they are remarkable plays, undoubtedly. But maybe when we come to discuss, drama, we may discuss Shakespeare in detail. But until that point of time, our interest in Shakespeare is his contribution to poetry. Even if you take out his contribution to the world of drama, Shakespeare's name still stands out, because not many of us may be aware, but he is an extraordinary poet. In fact, even in his plays, you find an abundant and a rich use of poetry. In fact, you can even call that his plays are a cornucopia of rich imaginative poetry even there. So he has to his credit more than 150 sonnets, and in fact these sonnets are again shrouded in mystery, like the very personality of Shakespeare, which is shrouded in mystery. In fact, many believe that probably Shakespeare may be a pseudonym for some other writer. Many of them have even gone on to even allude that there was nobody called Shakespeare during that time. Shakespeare might have been a pen name or a kind of a pseudonym. It must be some other character, maybe it may be Bacon, all those kind of allusions have come. Let's leave these debates aside, Even his sonnets are shrouded in mystery, because they are dedicated to a mysterious person called Mr. W.H. They are just dedicated to a person and who is identified by his initials, W and H. Again, there are a lot of theories concerning who this W.H. is. Is he a patron of Shakespeare? Is he a friend of Shakespeare? And there are a lot of discussions around that equation between that particular person and Shakespeare and all that. We are not going into all that non-literary discussion. He has dedicated most of these sonnets to this particular friend and patron, and about 25 and odd sonnets to a kind of, again, another mysterious dark lady, maybe his lady love, maybe again a lady patron, we do not know, to a dark lady. It has been dedicated to dark lady, about 25 or 28 odd ones, about 155 out of them, majority of them dedicated to a mysterious friend W.H., and another 20 odd sonnets to a dark lady. Okay. If you look at these sonnets, they are an extraordinary contribution. That is precisely what I was saying. Even if you take away all the plays that are attributed to Shakespeare, Shakespeare's name would still be written in the golden letters because of his sonnets. These sonnets exemplify the writer's imagination, creativity, their perspective towards life, their literary craftsmanship, the use of language, the use of diction. Take up any measure, any standard, these sonnets stand out. Well, in order to give you a glimpse of the quality of these sonnets, let us directly delve into these sonnets themselves. But apart from these sonnets, he also has to his credit other poems called Venus and Adonis, remarkable piece, and The Rape of Lucrece, a kind of a satire, but still an important contribution to poetry. So, here we have with us a beautiful sonnet, and when we read the sonnet, what you can also do, you can note down some of the predominant figures of speech employed here, and thereby you can also enhance your understanding of figures of speech. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You are more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease is all too short a date. Again, please go on noting down the rhyme scheme, because his sonnets are a kind of a rich sources for any student of literature. You can study it from their structural perspective, from their creative perspective, from the perspective of figures of speech employed there, from the perspective of a rich a rich way of life presented in them, all these things. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease has all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. But your eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owes, nor shall death brag you wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So these lines are used symbolically or metaphorically, figuratively, in order to capture how you can make a mortal being immortal. So this is where probably mortal beings can claim victory over death. How? Because when their names are etched in literature, when their names are etched in literature, as long as literature lives, their name also lives, that person also lives. So this is one way of conquering death. So he is saying to the person he addresses, he says, it's true, you are beautiful, you are more beautiful than this, you are more beautiful than that, but what I can make you, well, after a certain time, this beauty that you are so proud of may vanish, and I have a way to make it immortal. How do I make it? When I put your name in my sonnets, I am going to make you immortal. Look at the confidence of the writer. Look at how beautifully the writer and confidently declares that he is going to make that person immortal, and how prophetic that was. Had it not been, if it were not for the reference in these kind of sonnets, we wouldn't even have read about that person today, because history has witnessed so many beautiful people, so many handsome people. So not all of them are recalled except during their lifetime, and especially except by those that are around those people. No one else remembers them, right? But now, because of the sonnet, all of us at least for some time come to scratch our head about the beauty of this lady or beauty of this person, right? So this is the power of literature, that it can make human beings immortal. So this is something that has to be kept in mind. From Shakespeare's sonnet, I have another sonnet. Again, for want of time, I am not reading it. Again, it's a this particular sonnet is dense. It's dense in the sense that it makes use of dense similes. If there is one poem that stands out for using simile, it's a direct comparison, right? My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. So he goes on directly comparing the so-called dark lady to very many objects, natural objects, direct comparison. So this poem exemplifies the use of a simile. You can take a look at this poem. It's called sonnet number 130. From Shakespeare, we move on to John Milton. Again, Milton is a kind of an iconoclastic name when it comes to English poetry. Milton, after a while, loses sight of loses his sight. He can't see. Nevertheless, he continues writing poetry. He continues writing his service to literature, especially his poem. On his blindness is an extraordinary poem, a short poem. He says, now imagine what happens. What would be the plight of a writer, who has relied on his eyes to see and write. all of a sudden if he loses sight of his eyes, what happens to the person? What happens to the person? How can he read? It's like weaning him away from the very source of life, right? So during those desperate times he writes that particular poem on his blindness, and that's where you come across these immortal lines, those lines that are a kind of a treasure house for any optimist. He says, they also serve who only stand and wait. You don't need to, he says that I have lost my eyes, how do I serve God, I can't do anything. Then towards the end of that particular poem, he says, they also serve who only stand and wait, because probably it's at kind of a testing time. So if we can learn to be patient without complaining, if we can endure even that, and gracefully weather that kind of pressure, it's kind of grace under pressure. If we can maintain that, it's also another kind of service to God. These remarkable lines, his contribution to English literature is immense, especially through his Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. These are two of his immortal works, greatest epics. In fact, these are modern epics. These are great epics in English literature, and they establish his preeminent position in English poetry, these works. From John Milton, we move on to metaphysical poetry. In fact, with the discussion of metaphysical poetry, we are going to end this class, and maybe in the next class we are going to take up discussion of English poetry, post metaphysical poetry until its modern practice, modernist poetry. Metaphysical poetry is a kind of a revolutionary poetry. It's a kind of a welcome deviation from the neoclassical poetry practiced during the Miltonic times, be it in terms of the subject matter, the use of language, the use of diction, and their attitude towards life. It's totally revolutionary. And interestingly, metaphysical poetry can be called a kind of an equivalent of bhakti poetry in the Indian context, because bhakti poetry is revolutionary in very many ways. Metaphysical poetry is also revolutionary. It's religious, but not in a conventional sense of the term, So through their ingenious use of conceits, irony, and metrical compositions, or flexibility in the way they compose it, it brings in a kind of a whiff of fresh air into English poetry. One of the remarkable traits of metaphysical poetry is their use of conceit, a specialized literary device, figure of speech called conceit. So in conceit, it's a comparison. Well, remember, when it comes to comparison, you have simile and metaphor, but conceal is a kind of a strange comparison. When you look at a conceit, you will be surprised. Until you read the entire poem, you don't know on what basis the poet is comparing one with the other. For instance, the poet compares John Donne, who is probably one of the quintessential metaphysical poets, compares lovers to a pair of compass. He compares lovers to a pair of compass, that geometrical box that you find, that compass. Why does he compare? What are the grounds for comparison? It may sound strange, but when you read it, you realize that it's with the help of this literary device. He almost fuses two disparate, dissimilar things. It's like there is a definition. One of the definitions of conceit is this, that two objects are violently yoked together. Probably it's Johnson who says it, or maybe some other literary critic. Two disparate objects are violently yoked together, but not because, of course, there is no scope for a natural comparison, but when you complete reading the poem, you understand the beauty of that comparison all the more. So, that is metaphysical, that is a quintessential trait of metaphysical poetry. All right. Some of the well known practitioners of this particular movement of poetry or genre of poetry are John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan and others. If you have read this poem called The Pulley, there is a beautiful poem called The Pulley, again a very important metaphysical poem. He compares stress, the poet compares stress, the pressure that we have, anxiety that we have, the stress that we face in human life to pulley, like the pulley is used as a kind of a leverage to push something ahead. He says anxiety, sorrow or lack of happiness, God uses these qualities as a pulley, so that using them God pushes us towards him, he pushes human beings towards himself, he uses them as a kind of a leverage, a very interesting conceit that the poet uses. And one of the remarkable traits of metaphysical poetry is a kind of a dramatic beginning. More than dramatic, it is a kind of a shocking beginning. Right in the very first line, the poet makes the reader sit tight, sit up and tight and read it. Now look at this. Death, be not proud, though some have called you mighty and dreadful, for you are not so. Look at the kind of a dramatic challenge. Death, you be not proud. Many have called you, mighty and dreadful. Of course, rightly, right? Because death is called the great leveler, a great equalizing force. Whatever we may be during our life, a king, queen, an ordinary person, a clerk, a pure slave, whatever these may be during our roles on this planet, death brings an end to all of us. That is why it is called the great leveler, So, therefore, it is called very mighty. But now look at the challenge. The poet here challenges death and says, do not be so proud that you are powerful. In fact, you are definitely not powerful. I can defeat you. I can defeat you. Something like that. And the rest of the poem explains why death should not be proud and how you score over death. Something like that. Similarly, that is a kind of a shocking challenge and a shocking beginning. Similarly, you also have another poem called the sun rising, and here again he says sun, it is a direct challenge to the sun. He says, sun, do not be so proud, I can eclipse you, in the blink of an eye I can eclipse you. Now look how beautiful, right? How beautiful, What happens? Many say sun is all powerful and all that, but when you close your eyes, you are going to, at least metaphorically, it appears as if you are eclipsing sun, at least from your perspective, right? So, this is metaphysical poetry in a nutshell for us, shocking beginning, use of strange comparisons, unconventional tone, unconventional diction. And strangely, most of these practitioners are, they have a religious background, So, you can call metaphysical poetry a kind of an equivalent of bhakti poetry in the Indian context. Before I end, I am sure you enjoyed this lecture as well. We began our discussion of this class with, from Middle English poetry onwards. We discussed, precursors of Shakespeare and introduction of sonnet here, Philip Sidney's defense of poetry, and then we discussed the greatness of Shakespeare. We even read some interesting sonnets by Shakespeare, and now of course we are ending this with a discussion of metaphysical poetry, John Donne, and some interesting comparisons and poetic techniques used here. Okay. So, in the next class we would complete our discussion of an overview of English poetry. So, beginning with the origins, we have come up to metaphysical poetry. So, in the next class we are going to complete our understanding of an overview of English poetry. All right, until then, take care. Thank you.